AI and the rise of deepfakery. Welcome to 39 Essex Chambers AI and the Law podcast. I'm David Mitchell, a junior barrister at 39 Essex Chambers. The subject of today's podcast is AI and the rise of deepfakery. To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Hanna and Mark Jones, partners from the law firm Payne, Hicks, who are specialists in dealing with legal issues arising from deepfakes. Hanna specialises in the law of defamation, privacy and breach of confidence. She's described by Chambers UK and Chambers High Net Worth Work UK as a standout, brilliant practitioner, and by the Legal 500 as astute and commercially minded. Mark is a specialist in criminal and regulatory defence work. He has a multi-jurisdictional practice and is described by the Legal 500 as utterly exceptional. Hanna and Mark's practices are complementary. They regularly work together to support clients facing privacy, reputation, criminal and regulatory issues. Welcome to today's podcast, Hanna and Mark.
Thanks, David.
Thanks.
Before starting our discussion, I think it's important to consider what we mean by a deep fake. A deep fake is a portmanteau term which combines deep learning and fake. Deepfakes are a form of synthetic media in which audio or video content is manipulated to make them indistinguishable from real media. And by synthetic media, we mean the artificial production, manipulation, and modification of data and media by automated means, especially through the use of generative AI. And in terms of this debate, it's important to recognize that the word deepfake is controversial. It originates from a Reddit user called Deepfakes, who first popularized face-swapping celebrity faces onto the bodies of porn performers in 2017. And of course, the preponderance of deepfakes of this type are created and used by men against women and girls. In the context of the criminal law, in terms of new offences under the Online Safety Act, which we'll discuss later, the acronym IBSA, image-based sexual abuse, more accurately describes this type of media and how it is misused. However, for the purposes of our discussion today, it's convenient to use the shorthand deepfake to discuss this type of media. So to start off, if I could ask you this, please, Hanna. We know that media have always been susceptible to manipulation and exploitation, for example, for political reasons. So why is it that now there is such a concern around generative AI and deep fakes?
It's because it's all about the images, the pictures, the video. They just look real. There was a case I was involved in now 20 years ago, Naomi Campbell and Mirror Group, and the court in that case established that photographs have got a special quality to them. And in the House of Lords, Lord Nichols said that's why they're worth 1,000 words. So the positions moved on very much from the old days where it was words that can manipulate. It's now pictures, and we are trained to believe what our eyes see. They also hit at a time of a kind of dying press. The newspaper circulation is down. At the Society for Editors conference in April this year, they were looking at how they assess news content now, and in the good old days, you couldn't see the immediate online impact of what you were publishing, and now you can. So the news is being driven very much around what we find interesting than what is true or what we should be commenting on. So there's less of agenda setting by the news and more following just what we think is fun or exciting or interesting, and deepfakes come very much into that. There's also issues around postmodernism, which goes back to my philosophy degree. I think the value of truth, of absolute truth, has become kind of cut away in the last few years. People talk about my truth, they talk about different perspectives, and so there is no absolute truth anymore. And this has a real problem for the media landscape. They seem to be able to change what people can and can't say, what they can and can't deny. Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, being classic examples and well-publicised examples of denying the truth of images about them or the truth of audio about them. So I think there's a lot of dark arts and press manipulation that is hitting the press at a bad time with photos.
And if we think about this in practical terms, and thinking in particular about the practices which both of you have, but perhaps, Mark, if I ask you this, what are the practical issues that one comes across when dealing with deepfakes?
I think, as you said in your description earlier on, deepfakes are the 21st century version of photoshopping, and they cover a multitude of sins. And it's the relative ease with which content can be manipulated, whether that's voice content, video content. You don't necessarily need a great deal of skill or equipment in order to be able to create a deep fake. And there's little cost involved in terms of you're not having to pay significant amounts in order to download and obtain software in order to be able to create a deep fake. It's something anybody can do at home with very little knowledge around the subject. There's also a lack of detection and verification techniques in order to identify media which has been manipulated. A good example is in February this year, Nick Clegg, Meta's president of global affairs, said that it was not yet possible to identify all AI-generated content. And that's quite worrying, and I think shows us the problem that we're dealing with, that if we can't spot it yet, then we're always going to be playing catch up. People can, and quite often do, strip out the invisible markers that would otherwise suggest that content was manipulated, again, making it harder for platforms to spot easily where a deepfake is concerned. I think the next point is the lack of speed in taking deepfakes down. Platforms need to act quickly, if not very quickly, to stop deepfakes from spreading and causing further damage and harm to victims of deepfakes. But of course, this needs to be balanced with a need to ensure that only genuine fake content is removed. This is particularly true where there are certain individuals who have a tendency to dismiss real content as fake news. So there is a need to sort of be careful to make sure that only genuine deepfakes are being taken down. And then finally, I think from my perspective, it's a lack of legal mechanisms, both domestic and internationally, to regulate the misuse of the technology, whether it's in civil or criminal law, and also the lag that there is in terms of legislation to deal with deepfakes. And a good example is that I think the Law Commission back in 2018, in their report, highlighted abusive and offensive online content. That then made it into a final report from the Law Commission in 2022. But we didn't have the Online Safety Act until 2023, and the criminal offences in relation to that didn't come into effect until the end of January 2024. So this isn't something that we didn't know was coming. It's taken a very long time to get to where we are in terms of practically dealing with it.
And we'll talk in due course about the Online Safety Act and in particular about its shortcomings in terms of addressing the criminal wrongs which arise in the misuse of this technology. But broadening this out in terms of your expertise from the civil and criminal sides respectively, as I understand your practices, you represent clients who as victims fall within three broad categories when it comes to deep fakes. Firstly, there are those who are victims of image abuse, in particular intimate photos and videos which have been created. Then there are clients who are commercially exploited and are victims of ruses such as false endorsement. And then you represent politicians who have been misrepresented through manipulation of their voices and images. So dealing with those three categories in turn, first of all, if I could ask you, please, Hannah, in terms of image abuse, what is the extent of the problem?
It's significant, and it's directed mainly at women and girls, more so in school now than has ever been the case. I think the statistics are 95% of deepfakes are women and girls, and the other 5% are men. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of victims are BAME women and girls who disproportionately feature in deepfakes portraying sexual violence. And that's very worrying as a trend, as a topic. But for us as lawyers, it's probably the easiest thing to do something about. It's the easiest area of law in terms of being a civil claim or a criminal claim. We were involved, or my firm was involved, in the Georgia Harrison Stephen Bear claim recently that didn't involve a deep fake, but did involve an intimate video of her being posted online without her consent. And there was a criminal case that ran alongside a civil claim, and I dealt with a civil claim. And there's very easy kind of breach of privacy, data protection issues around your images, around your sexual content online. So it's a lot easier to take those sorts of images down, or to deal with deepfakes where they have a sexual tinge to them. And Mark probably can deal with the criminal side of it more, but this seems to be our kind of easiest way of getting through deepfakes.
What would be the criminal or the application of the criminal law in that type of scenario, Mark?
Before I go on to sort of explain that, perhaps it'd be helpful if I explained to the listeners what image-based sexual offences are. And it's quite a wide term that covers the non-sensual creation and distribution of private sexual images. It covers revenge porn, such as in George's case that Hannah talked about, taking or sharing hacked images, upskirting, voyeurism, as well as threats to share images. And I think a well-known example would be in January of this year, there was the Taylor Swift deepfake. And that's kind of a good example of image-based sexual abuse. And the law is now starting to send out a clear message that this is not to be tolerated. And if we turn to the Online Safety Act 2023, there are two sections that are particularly important when we come to image-based sexual abuse. The first is Section 187, which relates to cyber flashing. But perhaps more important for today's purposes is Section 188, which covers sexually orientated deepfakes, revenge porn, and that creates 4 offences which have been inserted into the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And they are the intentional sharing of a deepfake, which carries up to 6 months imprisonment. And then there are another 3 offences which carry up to 2 years imprisonment. They are where a person intentionally shares a deepfake with the intent to cause alarm, distress, or humiliation. Perhaps it doesn't take a genius to think that anyone that shares a sexually explicit deepfake is going to cause alarm and distress to the recipient. The third offence is where a deepfake is shared with the intent of causing sexual gratification. And the final offence is where a person threatens to share a deepfake with the intention of the person believing that the deepfake is going to be shared. It doesn't matter whether or not the deepfake is in fact actually shared. It's the threat that's enough.
And we'll come back to the criminal law in due course. But in terms of the second category of client victim, those who are victims of commercial exploitation, how does this manifest? What are these sorts of cases that you're seeing here?
There's a lot of cases that we see with people being imposed onto advertising. Mary Nightingale was one on ITV News, where there's a deepfake which showed her sitting at her desk in the ITV news studios, but behind her there was a financial services product. And ITV started looking into this. I spoke to them about it. And it's quite an interesting topic because the law is still there to protect individuals. It goes back to the kind of online false endorsement cases, or the very old false endorsement cases along the lines of Tolley and Fry, if anyone remembers that. I can remember doing it at law school. And that case was a classic. It was from 1931 and may have been the start of deepfakes, but it was a caricature of Cyril Tolley, who was pictured with a Fry's chocolate bar. And he had nowhere to go with this claim. So he went in defamation and he said it would look defamatory of him to think that he had endorsed Fry's Tolley's bars because it would make it look like he was breaching his amateur status, and he would then forfeit his amateur status because he was making a commercial profit out of it. And from that case, there are kind of other cases that have come up, that the Irvine TalkSport case. And again, with Eddie Irvine, you would think that the primary claim would be a copyright claim, but actually the copyright in the photograph that had been put out of him by TalkSport. So TalkSport was rebranding from Talk Radio to TalkSport. And in doing so, they put out images of famous people. And the idea was that the famous people were endorsing TalkSport, or that's what Eddie Irvine said was happening. He didn't have a copyright claim because they had bought the copyright lawfully, but he had a claim in passing off in a false endorsement claim. So that there are these early trends of cases where there has been commercial damage to people that have start off in defamation, maybe move into passing off. There's fraud claims. Copyright can be tricky because you would have to prove that you own the copyright of the photograph. But there is definitely things that can be done in the civil courts. And there's been recent developments in malicious falsehood, which means that malicious falsehood is also in play. Defamation, of course, if you can prove that someone is subject to ridicule, or it looks like they're endorsing a product that they wouldn't endorse. It can create employment issues. So there's lots of avenues that can be explored in these cases. It's just a question of getting the facts working with the law.
Yes. And then in terms of political disinformation, I appreciate it might seem slightly, well, in the present context, to describe politicians as being victims of any type of wrong is perhaps a difficult point to make. But notwithstanding, what are the types of victims and the issues that they have, which you've come across in your experience?
David, just before we move on to that topic, I wonder if I could just go back a moment just to talk about fraud in terms of commercial exploitation.
Yes, please do, Mark.
I think very recently there's been a well-reported case in Hong Kong where a company was the target of a deepfake scam, which saw an employee pay out $25 million to fraudsters. It was quite sophisticated because in that case, an employee was duped into attending a video call with people who he believed were the CFO and other members of staff. They were all, in fact, deepfakes, and this individual was the only person in the room. And I think this really identifies the scale of commercial exploitation and fraud. Clearly, there are offences under the Fraud Act here in the UK, fraud by false representation, creating an article for use in fraud. So I think the Fraud Act is there to tackle these types of deepfakes, albeit deepfakes are not something that the law is used to dealing with. So we'll wait to see how that plays out. But it seems to me there is very clear criminal liability. And also turning to the Online Safety Act, it's seen the introduction of key duties for tech firms in this area. The campaigner Martin Lewis has been very forthright in terms of ensuring that all platforms now must use proportionate measures relating to the design or operation of the service and ensure that fraudulent content or harmful content is removed and swiftly removed at that. Sorry, that was all I wanted to just add on the issue of sort of commercial exploitation before we moved on to politics.
It's important, Mark, because it chimes with the points that Hannah was making in terms of seeing these issues rather than being a manifestation, which they obviously are, of this very new and very powerful technology, which we're all having to grapple with, not just within the law, but more widely. Seeing this within more structured common law, sometimes statutory, criminal, civil wrongs, perhaps gives us some indication and some optimism about the ability of the law to be able to deal with these types of challenges so that the people who you are representing perhaps 5 years hence will not be in such a difficult position. But on that point, political disinformation, how does that crop up? What are the types of issues that you see there?
I think if I give some very well-known examples just to illustrate the type of problem that we're dealing with here, David Cameron was subjected to a deepfake video call with the former president of Ukraine. In January alone, more than 100 adverts impersonating Rishi Sunak reached as many as 400,000 people and induced deepfake BBC News reports of an alleged corruption scandal. In 1 month alone, that was the scale of the reach of these deepfakes. There's the well-known deepfake audio of Keir Starmer, supposedly verbally abusing his staff. And then finally, Sadiq Khan, there was a deepfake audio suggesting that he'd suggested that Armistice Day commemorations should be postponed in favour of pro-Palestinian march. And I think that really highlights the dangers around deepfakes in terms of political disinformation.
Yeah, and how would that be approached through the law, Mark?
So if I deal with the criminal law, first of all, it's not generally an offence to impersonate another person, and that includes politicians. However, if that impersonation is for fraudulent reasons, then it could amount to an offence under the Fraud Act 2006. Turning to the Online Safety Act 2003, disinformation and fake news are covered by Section 179. It's the so-called sending false communications offence and covers a situation where information is conveyed which the sender knows to be false, and they intend to cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm to a likely audience. And what that means is that it's someone who's likely to read it, whether they're the original recipient or after it's been subsequently shared, carries a maximum sentence of 6 months imprisonment. Also turning to electoral law, The Representation of the People Act states it's an illegal practice to make a false statement concerning the personal character or conduct of a candidate for the purpose of effecting the return of any candidate. In other words, calculated to influence voters. So there is protection there in terms of criminal law and routes that are available.
Hanna, you've already touched on some of the civil avenues of redress, and we'll deal with those a bit further in due course. But Mark, just on the criminal side, I alluded to this earlier, there was a lacuna in the Online Safety Act in that it didn't criminalise the creation as distinct from the dissemination, the sharing of deepfakes. And there was an announcement by the Ministry of Justice in April of this year that it was proposed that the Criminal Justice Bill be amended to involve a new offence proscribing the creation of deepfake sexually explicit images, which of course what generative AI is responsible for in this criminal content without the consent of the victim portrayed. Now, with the wash-up of Parliament before its dissolution with the forthcoming election, that amendment hasn't proceeded any further. Is it your view, Mark, that it's practically inevitable, whatever the complexion of the new government when it arrives very shortly, this is going to be back on the political agenda and we'll see it in criminal law shortly?
I certainly hope so. I think you referred to it as a lacuna that creation hasn't been criminalised. I think I would refer to it as a glaring error that we criminalise those who share, but the actual creators of this content are not the target of the Online Safety Act as it stands at the moment. So I would certainly hope that whoever the next government is does treat this as a priority, given that online harm and online sexual harm is an increasing topic. And I would expect that this will make its way into statute books at some point.
Although I anticipate that the definition of this area will be quite difficult because, of course, you can't strike at the creation of AI, either generative AI or people using AI tools to do good things. It's when they're using them to do bad things. And that always creates problems for the lawmakers. And I think that's probably why they started off with trying to stop their dissemination and their use rather than stopping the use completely. I mean, stopping the use of deepfakes is obviously important, but defining them so you don't stop the other creative uses of AI will be the tricky thing.
Yeah, and doubtless there'll be lots of law looking at that particular issue within the context, obviously, of consent and also mens rea. But beyond the criminal law and the civil law, how does one go about taking this offending material down from the internet?
And that can be the tricky thing. And it's tricky partly because I'm going to say when the internet came in, I'm not sure that's the right phrase, but there was an idea that the internet wasn't really competing with the proper news sources. So it had a high degree of latitude. There were various defences that were brought in under the Defamation Act, under the e-commerce regs to encourage people to be able to use social media so that it could compete with the newspapers. And now we're in a position that we're trying to rein it back in. So all those defences are there, probably were put in before we thought about the harm that could be caused with deepfakes and AI. And so it can make it quite difficult to get stuff down from the internet. In George's case, that was one of the most difficult problems we faced, because even when information had come down or the video had come down from some websites, it would go up on a different website. And some of those websites are out of the jurisdiction. The Online Safety Act should help us in that way, as will Ofcom, and Ofcom bringing in fines to try and regulate what the media companies can do. But I think that will be a slow process in itself.
If one doesn't have the likes of yourself, Hanna, or Mark at their disposal, specialist lawyers who understand the different civil, criminal, regulatory routes to try to address the very serious issues that can arise where someone is a victim of a deep fake. What does the litigant in person do? Is the litigant in person, the unrepresented party, hopeless, if you like, in the situation?
There are procedures from the websites. They are meant to be following good governance. They're meant to be dealing with complaints and taking material down in a reasonable time. It can be difficult for litigants acting by themselves to get material taken down from the internet. because they're not pressing the right buttons to get their claims dealt with properly and by the right people. So we come into play there quite a lot, but I don't think people should be nervous about contacting lawyers, especially nice lawyers like Mark and I, because we're always quite happy to talk things through with people. Lots of times it's just a letter that has to get sent as opposed to a big piece of litigation, or Mark often spends time dealing with criminal complaints so that they get to the right person, as opposed to just being filed at the local police station where there aren't the resources all the time to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think Hannah's made a good point there that any individual who is the victim of one of these criminal offences can, of course, report it to the police. But I suppose when making a report to the police, it's understanding how the criminal justice system works, that it's likely to take a long time before the victim sees justice. It may be many years after the event, and they would then see themselves reliving the harm that they'd suffered when the deepfake was shared. Also, AI is an ever-changing beast, and the need for police forces and specialist investigators to be able to keep up with that, I think, is quite difficult. When already in the criminal justice system, we see significant delays when police officers seize electronic devices. It can take many months before those come back. Against that backdrop, I think justice is not going to be swift where these particular offences are concerned. And I suppose it's ensuring that police officers are directed towards the relevant offences and given as much assistance as possible in terms of the reporting, because this is a new area of law for them as it is for everybody.
Yes, and of course, I appreciate, Mark, you have a multi-jurisdictional practice. We've spoken today almost exclusively about the law as it operates in this jurisdiction. But of course, when something goes on the internet, then there is no boundary, no national boundary jurisdiction in terms of where it might end up. Do you have a view, Mark, on how the legal position under EU law differs compared to where we are here with the Online Safety Act?
The EU Digital Services Act includes the power to fine social media platforms which fail to tackle disinformation. I think more recently, though, in March of this year, the EU AI Act was adopted by the European Parliament. And although it doesn't go as far as banning deepfakes, we are expecting codes of practice to come from the AI office in terms of the labelling of deepfakes. I think that will be incredibly useful, and we may see the UK adopting a similar approach. But I think the labelling of deepfakes would be incredibly helpful. But until that becomes law in member states, sharing or explicit deepfakes and revenge porn is not likely to be criminalised until the middle of 2027, or that's the current thinking at the moment. And again, until then, the victims are relying on a patchwork of local laws, such as the EU's Privacy Bill, GDPR, and national laws on defamation.
When you talk, Mark, about labelling, is that the sort of verification tools issue that we hear the big online platforms talking about?
I think it's more in terms of when you're talking about a deepfake, what do you mean? What does it cover? Because I think we've been very careful in the UK not to mention the word deepfake in legislation. We refer to AI because I think if we label the word deepfake, it could become out of date very soon, and it's not necessarily clear what we're dealing with.
I see. And Hannah, from your practice, any thoughts on how the position might differ outside this jurisdiction?
I think each jurisdiction is going to be very different from the UK because there are just a different variety of laws that we can use here. Europe aligns with us to some extent because of the privacy laws. And America, of course, they've got more value in free speech and the Free Speech Act. So America's always going to be slightly different from Europe and probably slightly different from the UK. So I think all the countries are going to deal with this problem differently. But as we've seen from other technological advances, they are all going to deal with it in some way.
And finally, a question I'd like to ask both of you, and it's something which Catherine Apps, Casey, and I, Catherine being the other host of this podcast, had asked all of our interviewees during the course of these episodes over the last year or so. And it goes beyond the legal, but it can be Just Legal if you'd like. It's to do with your views personally in terms of your pessimism or your optimism regarding generative AI and where we might end up with it. So on a scale of 0 being the most pessimistic through to 10 being the most optimistic, what do you think the future holds in terms of AI? If I ask you, Mark, first of all.
I think I'm probably about a 7.5.
That's very precise.
I am quite pessimistic. And I think the nature of the work that we do, I think I am quite pessimistic, seeing the harms that are caused. I think deepfakes and AI have the potential, in fact, more than potential, they do harass, intimidate, abuse, demean, undermine, and destabilize. And I think it's such a powerful tool that we really do need to be tackling this in perhaps a more effective way. You know, if it has the power to potentially shift share prices, to change the way people vote, to make people the victims of sexual abuse, I am concerned for the future. Hannah may be not quite as pessimistic as me, I don't know.
It's 7.5. You say you're a pessimist, Mark, but I think if you listen to our other podcasts, you'll probably find that's towards the upper end of the optimism scale. But Hannah, where do you see yourself on a 0 to 10?
As normal, I'm going to be more optimistic than Mark. I think the law's got the tools to deal with these situations. The media courts in particular are used to the shifting landscape of privacy rights, of data rights, and they are on top of these things. They're always slightly behind. The law's always going to be slightly behind, but I think we'll get there. And I think all these new provisions and acts that are coming in that Mark's been talking about in the criminal sphere, but also the ability of the media courts to move with the times, as they've had to through kind of email and internet and all these great changes that I've seen in my career. I think we'll get there. Well, it's just going to take a bit of time.
Well, on that optimistic note, if I can thank the both of you, Hannah and Mark, for taking the time to come and speak to me today and to be part of the 39 Essex Chambers AI and the Law podcast. And thank you very much to you, the listener, for listening. All other episodes of this podcast are available on Chambers' website, 39essex.com.